Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of American cultural history, and particularly culture in the era of Jim Crow. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the career and exploits of the notorious and controversial black heavyweight boxing champion Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was the son of two former slaves who rose to prominence in the realm of boxing, rising to become the colored heavyweight champion of the world in 1903. Up to that point in his career, he had been restricted to facing almost exclusively black opponents. However, the white heavyweight champion of that era, Tommy Burns, began to feel the pressure to confront this noteworthy opponent because Tommy Burns was left with few quality opponents in the white ranks, while it was understood that Jack Johnson was by far the greatest among the black boxers. And so in December of 1908, Tommy Burns relented and allowed Jack Johnson to challenge him for the heavyweight champion of the world. Of course, Jack Johnson won that bout, which created a conundrum now for white America. We had a black heavyweight boxing champion, and the only way to unseat him was for someone to beat him in the ring, which of course proved to be incredibly difficult. Now, Jack Johnson created a point of black pride in an era when, as we've discussed, segregation was fierce all across the country, racism was very evident, lynching and violence prohibited blacks from achieving many things in the country, and yet a black heavyweight champion was able to knock out white opponents in the ring, and blacks all around the country took notice. Of course, whites took notice as well. And while on the one hand, scholars note that some white observers took a sort of sick pleasure in watching their own being beaten by a black man, which is something that no one ever saw in this country. On the other hand, most whites were incredibly troubled by this, and they were certainly looking out for anyone to knock off this black champion. The quest for a quality white opponent to defeat Jack Johnson came to be known as the search for the Great White Hope. The most promising of these white hopefuls for the title was Jim Jeffries, the former heavyweight champion who had a long reign and was once considered one of the all-time greats. But he had been retired for 5 years when he finally agreed to step into the ring with Jack Johnson in 1910. He said, "I am going into this fight for the sole purpose of proving that a white man is better than a Negro." The fight was promoted by Tex Rickard, one of the great hucksters of his day, who built up a huge amount of anticipation for the fight, which he arranged in Reno, Nevada, a small town at that time. They constructed a new stadium seating some 22,000 people and brought in people by the trainload specifically to watch this fight. The fight itself proved to be much more one-sided than white viewers had hoped, as Johnson easily battered the aging and slow-footed Jim Jeffries. And finally, in the 15th round, after being knocked down and even knocked out of the ring, Jeffries' corner threw in the towel, and Johnson won the fight convincingly. While the audience in attendance was stunned almost into silence as they filed out of the stadium, the reaction all around the country and even around the world was much more violent, as race riots broke out across much of the country, as blacks celebrated the victory and whites clamped down, trying to restrict them even further. This was also the era when film was beginning to evolve, and there were films of this fight and a number of other Johnson fights. There was a movement to suppress the film, which many thought showed an unhealthy viewing of a black man beating up a white man in the ring. And so the film was suppressed in parts of the country and even around the world, as Americans didn't want this questionable film to circulate worldwide. The progressives of this era, who we've talked about in previous lectures, while they did promote equality and the betterment of so many Americans and immigrants, actually supported the suppression of this film. Of course, blacks all around the country wanted to view the film, and many whites as well, so it was very difficult. Even as it was illegal to view the film, it was difficult to completely suppress it. In the aftermath of the Jeffries fight, Johnson reigned as heavyweight champion for 5 more years, continuing to raise questions throughout the country. While many blacks supported and celebrated his accomplishments in the ring, there were also those who questioned him and had some problems, particularly with his behavior outside of the ring, when he had at least 3 marriages to white women and a number of other relationships. He was very brash and outspoken. He was a flashy dresser and a fast driver who just raised all kinds of questions about the so-called proper behavior of blacks in the country. And so even some blacks had questions and problems with supporting Jack Johnson. But of course, the multitude of whites around the country were horrified at what they saw in this black champion. Even though they were hard-pressed to find the so-called Great White Hope who could successfully defeat Jack Johnson, the quest to bring him down in other ways continued outside of the ring. Johnson was ultimately convicted for violating the Mann Act, which was essentially a ban on prostitution. It forbid the transporting of women across state lines for immoral purposes. And in fact, Jack Johnson had transported a young woman named Belle Schreiber across state lines. But most historians would agree that these were trumped-up charges brought against Johnson more for who he was than what he might have done wrong. Nonetheless, he was convicted in 1913 and embarked on a part of his life where he fled the country, lived in Europe, and traveled around other parts of the world. Gradually, during this era, his career began to decline and his money began to run out. In 1915, finally, he was defeated of his championship in a bout in Havana, Cuba, under the hot sun. And finally, after 5 more years, he relented, returned to the United States, and served 10 months in prison. Johnson died in a car accident in 1946 and remained a controversial figure for many years in the aftermath. As a final footnote to this, in 2018, Jack Johnson was pardoned by President Donald Trump after a campaign by Ken Burns and a number of other prominent figures to bring that justice to Jack Johnson posthumously. So, Johnson's record was cleared long after his death, but he remains a controversial testament to culture in this era of Jim Crow. In our next lecture, we'll talk about the growing intellectual and literary tradition among African Americans in that era.